as well as Danielle Cerny from the Harvard Civ Lab, and they're going to take us through some specifics of projects that they were intimately involved in helping to construct. So I'm extremely excited to hear from Janice and Danielle. Hearing from your feedback from the first webinar, we also included an opportunity for question and answer after each one of their presentations. So we want to be a little more mindful of the ability to have some back and forth with folks who are on the webinar. So I'm going to start just by actually taking a roll. Could you unmute the lines, Sam? And everyone make sure that you're unmuted because we're going to do a quick roll of folks who are on the phone. So I'm going to go grantee by grantee, and I recognize that there may be some folks who are subs. So if you are a sub of the grantee that I call out, please let us know who you are and where you're calling from. So first is Corporation for Supportive Housing. Anybody from CSH on the phone?
Hi, Jenny. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, this is Josephine.
Hi, Josephine. Any of your subs joining us today?
I'm not sure if they're on the line. Please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Okay, it doesn't sound like it. All right, we'll circle back later. Green and Healthy Homes Initiative.
Eric Lessinger is on.
Hi, Eric. Great. Any GHHI subs on the phone?
Julie Romine with Habitat for Humanity.
Kathy Marcinko with Le Bonheur.
Sarita Hudson with Partners for Healthier Community.
Great. Welcome, GHHI subs. So glad to have you. And Civ Lab.
Tayo Din.
Who's this?
My name is Tayo. I'm a current fellow with the Massachusetts PFF program.
Great. Hello. Thanks so much for joining us. Anybody else from Civ Lab?
Hi, this is Sarah. I'm with the Civ Lab.
Sorry, I didn't catch your name. What was that?
Sarah Allen.
Great. So glad to have you with us. Institute for Child Success.
Mary Garvey is on.
Megan Carolyn.
So Mary, Megan Carolyn, anybody else?
Megan Golden was on there, and I know several of our subs are on the call.
Great. Who do we have from your subs?
Chris Story, City of Spartanburg.
I think I also see.
I think two people spoke at once. Who was that?
You had Chris from the City of Spartanburg.
Yep. And who was after Chris?
So this is Kelly Noe from Sonoma County.
Sonoma.
Jen Lewis. I believe we have
Jen Lewis, also Sonoma County.
Great.
And I think I see on the phone Angus Mears from
Washington.
I am here. Right, Washington.
Great. Okay, thank you so much. So glad to have you today. NCCD.
Deirdre O'Connor here.
Hi, Deirdre. Any of your subs joining us today?
I'm actually not sure if any of them. I know my staff are otherwise committed. I'm not sure if any of the subs were able to make it or not.
No problem. Well, so glad you're with us. So I have a note from everyone at NFF is huddled around a phone but with no mic, so a virtual hello to everyone at NFF. Any nonprofit finance fund subs on the phone? Okay. Third sector. I know that third sector is in the middle of a big all-staff retreat, so we may be missing our third sector friends. Any subs from third sector on the phone? And Utah.
Hi, Jenny. You have most of the lab staff. This is Carrie, and I'm joined by Lindsay, Chad, Sarah, Jack, Katie, and Lisa.
My goodness. Well, so glad to have everyone on the phone out in Salt Lake. Any of your subs joining us?
I'm not sure if they are or not. I'd ask them to speak up if any of them are on the line.
Hey, Beth.
Okay. Well, let us know. Everybody write us in a chat if you're not able to use your phone. And I know that there are a handful of folks that are actually joining us from the Department of Education. You're welcome to introduce yourself. Or perhaps not. Well, thank you all for dialing in. Again, so glad to have you today, and I'm not going to take up any extra time before jumping right into turning it over to Danielle, who's going to walk us through the Massachusetts Juvenile Justice Project that you all know and love. Danielle was instrumental in getting this project up and running, so I'm going to go ahead and throw it over to Danielle.
Oh, Mark Tremblay from Department of Health is on too.
Great.
Welcome.
Hi, Mark. Thank you.
Hey.
Great. Well, thank you very much. This is Danielle. So just to give a little bit of background before we jump into the actual presentation, which I think is going to build really nicely on the first webinar, I first had my initial interaction with Massachusetts Pay for Success actually 3 years ago, back when I was a student at the Kennedy School. And I was a fellow in the Massachusetts Budget Office, just kind of charged with helping them look into whatever they thought was interesting at the time. And I was lucky enough that at that juncture was when the state was starting to first consider this crazy new thing at the time called Pay for Success. So I was there as the state did kind of initial investigations into whether Pay for Success was right for the state, and if so, where should they target the initial interventions. And then once I finished up my program at the Kennedy School, was lucky enough to come back and spend a year managing the programs. So rejoined after the ROCA initiative, which we'll talk about, had launched, and as kind of previewed by Jenny, have had the privilege of seeing this project intimately develop. And I'm really excited to use this as kind of our example to walk through some of the nuances of how to do financial modeling. So just to preview what's to come, we'll talk very briefly about the Massachusetts Juvenile Justice Project at a summary level. I know a lot of you are very familiar with it. And then we'll move right along into how to think about aligning goals and metrics, some of the key parameters that everyone should think about as they start to develop a cost-benefit analysis, how to then make the critical next step to actually putting numbers to those targets using historical baselines and thinking through average and marginal costs. And then finally, we're going to wrap this up with kind of the culmination, which is the payment schedule. Okay, so if we can move ahead to slide 5. One more. Perfect. This is a really high-level summary of the Pay for Success Juvenile Justice Project in Massachusetts, which launched in January of 2014. And as many of you know, it is focused on providing job readiness and life skills to high-risk young men who are either exiting or aging out of the criminal justice system in Massachusetts. And the explicit goals of the program are to reduce criminal recidivism and also to increase employment for this target population. And to do so, the state brought in some really skilled partners, notably our chosen service provider, which is ROCA, which is an evidence-based organization that really combines this relentless outreach and data-driven evaluation we'll talk more about in a few slides. The intermediary for the project is Third Sector. And then you can see we had an incredible variety of funders for this project, everything from the private Goldman Sachs to more local nonprofit organizations like New Profit and Boston Foundation. And this is going to be a 7-year project, and if we meet all of our success targets, it will be up to $28 million that the state ultimately pays for these services. And as far as I know, this is still the largest financial investment in a Pay for Success initiative in the country, so always a good example to come back to. And what we're going to do now is we're going to unpack this summary. So we'll walk through some of the key decisions and analysis that helped us get the Juvenile Justice Project from concept to contract. The starting point for any Pay for Success project is a really high-level understanding of what it is that you want to achieve. The goals for each project can't just be developed in a vacuum. Instead, really, procurement and contracting should be used to unite the government's goals around metrics and outcomes with the natural design of the program. And I know this can sound really obvious, but the more projects that we've done around Pay for Success, the more we've seen that too often service providers and the government get used to thinking about metrics just in relation to reporting and compliance. And they're not seeing performance as a meaningful opportunity to identify and pursue clear-cut goals. One of the great things is that Pay for Success can be an opportunity to break that kind of cycle. So what we have on slide 6 rather, is the natural ROCA intervention model. And as you can see, it's a phased progression. And as a young man moves through the model, he's going to receive different types of interventions, and different success measures therefore become appropriate at different junctures. So phase 1 is this intensive engagement where ROCA is going out and really trying to engage this population that often has not had reliant or consistent supports. And so as you can imagine, it often takes multiple contacts for ROCA to build up the trust that is necessary for these individuals to willingly come into ROCA and say, yes, I'm going to actively and fully engage in this program. But this gets you then to phase 2 once that trust has been built, where the focus goes from just active engagement to really intensive behavioral change. And it's at this point that we're able to start lining up with some of the early success payments around job readiness, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, but they're based on this regular contact with caseworkers, helping to build those critical life skills that we talked about on the last slide. And all of this is then moving people forward to phase 3, which is specifically focused in the programming to support sustained outcomes. And this lines up with the Pay for Success program's long-term success measures around avoided incarceration and increased employment. So this is all the starting point. And once you've aligned goals and metrics, like we did for the Juvenile Justice Project, you're ready to start refining, well, what are the actual savings parameters that we're talking about to start refining these goals? And that's what we have on slide 7. So as many of you know, social programs yield a variety of different types of savings. Kind of at its most basic level are budgetary savings. So this is what we think about all the time with programming. The savings the state reaps from avoiding prison days for the high-risk population, like the one targeted with the Juvenile Justice Project, or reductions in ER visits, or new tax revenue from increased employment for interventions. But there's more savings that we could start to quantify. So a second level up would be freed resources. So here you can imagine with the juvenile justice intervention, as individuals start to have successful interactions with ROCA and are removed from the criminal justice process, well, that can mean that police officers have some freed up resources. They have more time to potentially pursue other more costly or serious crimes. And this is something, while maybe a little less tangible, can certainly be quantified, and is a real benefit for governments. And then one more step removed are social benefits. And so we often think about these as the benefits that spill over beyond just the direct participants in a program. So one way you think of this are the benefits the society in general reaps from reduced victimization as crimes go down for the target population. And different governments have different appetites for including these types of savings. And as you can imagine, as you move down this list from budgetary savings to social benefits, it can become a bit more challenging to quantify and measure a program's benefits, which is why it's important early on to have a conversation with governments about what they are willing to include in their cost savings model. And slide 8 is an example of how those conversations went around the Juvenile Justice Project. So as we talked about, the basic outcome of reduction in bed days, which is really central to the Juvenile Justice Project, that's a budgetary saving, and it was, of course, included without debate in the model. Another budgetary type of saving is this idea of closing a prison wing or deferring construction of a new prison as you start to take young men out of the criminal justice system. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later. This is something that the state said, yes, that is a true quantifiable benefit. We're willing to include it, but with some nuance based on the probability that the saving will actually materialize and that the state will be able to realize those benefits. Then moving down the list, there were some freed up resources the state also wanted to quantify, largely around the reduction in public defender and court utilization costs. And while a small part of the model, this was included in our benefit cost analysis. And then finally on this list, the idea of the social benefit around avoided crime and victimization costs was a place where Massachusetts said for this project, we are not going to count that in the savings model. And that is something that is helpful to know up front, because the earlier you establish these parameters, the earlier that you can focus your analysis and investigation into the benefits that a government is willing to include, or sometimes just start conversations about a benefit that maybe was originally a no for inclusion, but is worthy of further investigation as the project develops. So deciding what kind of savings will count is just one step. Next, you have to determine the time horizon in which you're going to quantify those allowable benefits. Programs have short, medium, and long-term impacts, and some of the examples that are outlined on this slide very much match up to the ROCA intervention. So a short-term impact would be that regular caseworker engagement and helping to get young men coordinated with a supportive individual. Then, as you move to more of the medium-term benefits, we're talking about that subsidized employment and reduced recidivism that's captured in the project. A long-term impact, which we didn't capture and which isn't listed here, but you could think of would be, imagine lifelong earnings or an increased quality of life for a certain population. That is a long-term benefit that's worth considering. And governments are going to have varying willingness to pay for these type of benefits over the life of the project. And then, of course, you also have investors who understandably want to be paid sooner rather than later. And you'll see that most pay for success projects, because of that type of desire from investors, end up resulting in payments that are made in 2 to 5 years. So to balance the time needed to observe some of the longer lasting impacts with the investor's desire for earlier payouts, you'll find that a lot of projects will include several measures of success that are compensated on various timelines. And that's what we see on the next timeline, or the next slide rather. The Juvenile Justice Project launched in January of 2014 and started with, as we talked about, that intensive outreach effort. 1 year later, well, roughly 1.5 years later, is when we started to get to the point where we could do job readiness payments. And these are based on a predetermined number of contacts between a participant and a ROCA employee. And this might sound like more of an output than an outcome, as we like to talk about it in Pay for Success, because it's around how many contacts did somebody have, not necessarily what then resulted from those contacts. But everyone in the project, including the government, agreed that this was an acceptable early success measure and payment trigger because it showed ROCA's success around engagement. It's an early signal about whether the ROCA model is truly working, and this type of engagement is a prerequisite for the later success that we were hoping to achieve. And so a lot of projects will use this type of short-term, more output-oriented measure to try to strike a balance between that need for earlier payments and gauges of success versus the long-term, more measurable outcomes. And that's why as you move then 3 years out of the project, that's when we start to truly quantify the recidivism and employment benefits that occur within the life of the project. So once you have a sense of what types of savings you're counting and over what timeline, the next really big question is to whom do all of these benefits accrue and who's going to pay? Social programs have savings for lots of different levels of government. You've got federal, state, local, and it's rarely just kept to one of those levels. It usually crosses agencies and levels. And so it can be very challenging for one government entity to essentially stand up and say, I'm going to pay for all of the outcomes because I am reaping all of the benefits. And here I actually find it easiest to talk about a different Massachusetts example, which is the Chronic Individual Homelessness Initiative. And here, the benefit cost analysis really relied on reductions in Medicaid spending, but because of the 50-50 state-federal Medicaid split, Massachusetts as a state was only in a position to capture 50% of the intervention's overall benefits, and therefore was only going to pay for 50% of those benefits. And so that is a really critical component for figuring out a cost-benefit analysis for pay-for-success projects. But once you have those parameters and you have figured out who's going to benefit, who's going to pay, we have to start putting some actual numbers to everything. And ideally, you're going to do that using administrative data. Slide 12 is an example specifically from the Juvenile Justice Project around the post-release incarcerations for, it's actually historical DYS and probation cases. And all of this was done using the state's historical criminal justice records. And one of the real important reasons for using and doing a historical analysis is that it helps get you a rough sense of the population's outcomes so you know how to set realistic but ambitious targets. But it also is doing it using the same type of administrative data that will ultimately track the programs moving forward. So it creates both a sense of fairness, that you know how you'll be measured and for what, and it's also a good opportunity to work out any of the data kinks that you might not have anticipated before you got into the details. And what you see here is looking at these 10 different cohorts of young men who had gone through the criminal justice system, we were able to see the average number of incarcerations they had over a 5-year period. And this helped in a lot of ways. First, it showed that there was a consistent pattern between the cohorts. So just because we were looking at 2000 versus 2010, we were still seeing really consistent results for this population. And what it also showed us was that most of the reincarcerations that happen for our target population happen within the first 5 years after their initial release. And so if we could have a successful and meaningful impact in that time period, we could be confident that the individual would remain out of the criminal justice system even after the intervention ended and after we stopped observing their outcomes. So the next step is to quantify the impact level. And to do that, you really have to distinguish between what are called average and marginal costs. So cost data is usually reported as average costs. We see this all the time. The total prison budget divided by the number of prisoners gives you the average cost of jail for an individual. But what you need in order to price outcomes are the marginal costs. So these are the costs that will actually be reduced if one individual is removed from the prison population. And to show what this really means in contrast, we've got an example on slide 14 using hypothetical but roughly realistic numbers for the Juvenile Justice Project. So if you talk just in terms of average costs, the annual incarceration cost per prisoner it's staggering. It's $50,000 per year. But this number has a lot of assumptions built into it. It assumes all of the fixed costs for prison and jail. And so when you're breaking down then that number for how do you quantify the benefits on a per bed day avoided, we see there'd be $136 saved for each avoided bed day. But this is a really misleading picture because in reality, if the intervention is successful, we're removing some people from the system, but what we save is the marginal cost. And this is the cost of the bedding and the food and the health insurance costs while an individual is actually imprisoned. Because if you just remove even 100 young men from the system, you're not going to be able to really staff down, you're not going to be able to close a prison, those fixed costs aren't recouped. So here, just looking at marginal costs, we're talking about more like $15,000 per prison and $10,000 per jail. And the reason this nuance is important is because our population wasn't just going to one place. There was roughly a 50-50 split in who was going to prison and jail. And so that more nuanced understanding of what was happening on the margins ended up with then a savings of roughly $34 per day. You can see it's a huge difference, 136 versus 34. And so the implications of using average versus marginal costs are significant for getting a true understanding of the impact of these programs. But of course, then there's the question of scale. So some interventions, like the Juvenile Justice Project, will start to creep closer to reaping average costs as the scale of the intervention increases. So maybe you take 100 young men out of the system and we're only saving marginal costs. But what happens if we're talking about 500 young men? Well, then we worked out with the state, there actually was the potential that you could either close a prison wing or maybe defer cost of a future prison. And so what we worked to do was create a probability model that as the scale of the impact increased, the balance between marginal and average cost savings were changed. It was always a very conservative balance because, as you can imagine, it's hard to predict whether a prison will truly be closed and very hard to say that the state will be able to claim and reorient those savings towards something else. But it was still a legitimate consideration for the cost-benefit analysis. And that's why finally on slide 15, what you see is this smooth but still curved cost-benefit analysis in the end form. Because depending on the percentage of avoided bed days, the savings for the state change because it's now a different mix between marginal and average costs. And at our target reduction rate of 40%, which was informed by that historical analysis, this is where the investors largely break even. Up to this point, the state has been paying out based on the savings, and everything above that ends up now suddenly accruing savings beyond the cost of the program for the state. And like so many pay-for-success projects, there is a limit to then how those additional savings are split or shared, rather, with the investors. As we talked about, up to $28 million total is the full payout. So after you reach roughly 50% reduction rate, the savings are totally accrued to the state, no longer to the investors. But what you want to think about in general as you're creating your own cost-benefit payment schedule based on all of that work leading up to it is what are the incentives that you're creating with your different targets and your different payout structures. And so how is it appropriate to set ambitious goals and also to share the risk and the reward of the intervention as you move from low impact to high impact. And what I've included for anyone who's curious, but we won't talk about it now on slide 16, is a more nuanced breakdown of how the actual payments were both quantified and when they are paid. But all of this, the avoided bed days, is what's informing the table, the chart graph on slide 15. So that's it for kind of the planned walkthrough of the project. I am more than happy now to take any questions from anyone.
And if we don't have any questions right now, of course, you can hang on to them if they pop during Janice's presentation. We'll give folks just one more minute to think about whether there are any questions.
No problem, and I'm sticking around, so we can certainly take them all at the end.
Hey, Jenny and Danielle, this is Kevin Chan with GHHI. I have a question.
Great.
Yeah, thanks. That was really helpful. So I think a lot of our listeners right now are, in feasibility stage with their pay-for-success projects. Could you speak about, when you were going through your feasibility before transaction, like what did the evolution of your financial model look like? What assumptions did you have in there at the beginning and then had to change later? And could you just talk a little bit about the iterative process?
Sure. So one of the big assumptions was around the level of impact that we thought the intervention would have. And here's one where we've seen it with lots of different projects where, because the procurement process often calls for evidence-based service providers, different programs will come with their own studies that have been done about their intervention level. And usually, understandably, these are reliant on self-reported information from the past and rather non-rigorous evaluations. So what we had going into this process was the self-reported level of impact from the service provider. But when we went back and actually did the matching using historical analysis, we found it was not wildly off, but there had to be adjustments made to what we thought the impact would be. And you can imagine that as you're moving the number of bed days down that you expect to be saved from this program, that also influences then what the state expects to save. And so there are lots of ways that you can look at going back to, well, what savings are we willing to count in this model in general? And is this maybe now an opportunity for us to expand beyond the bucket that we were originally considering? So I think everyone going into these projects should know there's almost always adjustments. Especially as you do that critical historical analysis with administrative data that so few providers have had the opportunity to do before a Pay for Success project provides that opening. So always go in knowing you'll adjust, but we talked about there are all those different levers then to adjust accordingly. So thinking about the types of savings, the timeline over which they're going to accrue, and then which levels of government you can start to think about in terms of who reaps and who pays.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for your question, Kevin. Any other questions? Okay, let's move on to Janice.
Great, thank you. Next slide, please. I'm going to be talking about the Utah Preschool Pay for Success project that was initially launched as a proof of concept in 2013, and then after passing state legislation in 2014 was adopted by the state of Utah. And there were some changes to the financial model that were made when we scaled to the state, and I'm going to be using that as an example. So once it got scaled to the state of Utah makes success payments. The investors are Goldman Sachs for the senior loan and J.B. Pritzker is the subordinated loan, not the foundation but the individual. The providers are the Granite School District, which has about 80% of the slots, Park City School District, the Guadalupe School, Little Scholars and Smart Kids, which are high-quality daycare centers that offer preschool, and the YMCA, which is a not-for-profit. And one thing I do want to emphasize here is that they're all using the same preschool model. The Kellogg Foundation had funded a project where we implemented the Granite School District preschool model in Little Scholars, Smart Kids, and the YMCA. So there's an alignment of professional development coaching and the preschool model. The intermediary is United Way of Salt Lake, and the independent evaluator is Utah State University. Next slide, please. The target population are 3- and 4-year-old children who are eligible for the National School Lunch Program, so that's 185% of the federal poverty level. And the outcome metric for success payments is the state of Utah avoided special education cost. And how special education is funded in Utah is primarily a state funding item. And they fund it in two pieces. One is called, which is not the technical name, but we call resource special education. And that's the lower level of disabilities, learning disabilities, developmental delays, speech. These are the kinds of things that if children have an opportunity gap, they're not disabled per se, but they have an opportunity gap. And we know that children who start behind stay behind. And if they do not have access to high-quality early education, many of these children will later be referred to special education in elementary school because the opportunity gap does turn into a delay. The state of Utah also funds what's called self-contained weighted per pupil add-on for special education. That's autism, deafness. That is not something that regular education preschool can address, and that's not the problem we're trying to solve here, so we do not include that in the cost avoidance. Next slide, please. The evaluation methodology is a statistical projection model. All children who are funded through the Pay for Success loan receive a pretest. It's the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, which is a psychometric test that has a high degree of validity and reliability. And children who score 2 or more standard deviations below the mean, and if you're all familiar with statistics, that's basically the bottom 3% of the population on a normal distribution, at preschool entry are considered to be at risk for special education use in K through 12. And these children form the payment cohort. The investors fund the, and I'll use, 500, which is the example that I'm using in a few slides for the model. Let's assume 500 children are funded through the SIB, and let's say 20% of them score 2 standard deviations below the mean. That's a standard score of 70 or below. So 100 kids form the payment cohort. And it is only for those kids that the investor gets paid back for. But yet we know that once a child enters special education in elementary school, they rarely exit out. Nationally, only 5 to 10% of children who are assigned an IEP in elementary school ever exit out of special education. So we're not talking about 1 year of savings. We're talking about potentially 10 years of savings, depending upon whether or not the child graduates. And as a result, because the ratio of special education cost to preschool cost is quite large, and because we're talking about several years of cost avoidance, the payback for the children in the payment cohort, is enough to actually pay back the investors for all the children that were funded, plus a modest return. Children who are identified as having a disability in preschool are removed from the SIB and the study, and they receive an IEP. Again, we're not trying to solve the problem of children who have a disability and are identified as such in preschool. We're really trying to solve the problem of children being behind due to an opportunity gap, poverty, language, and if nothing is done to address that gap, those children have a high likelihood of being assigned to special education in K through 12. Well, we use the statistical projection model. I would recommend a rigorous evaluation model going forward using an experimental design, ideally an RCT. And I think that funding in general and outcome funders, as well as some investors, will require that. The statistical projection model worked well for us here in Utah, given our political situation, but I do recommend a more rigorous evaluation methodology going forward. Next slide, please. Success payments are 95% of the state of Utah weighted per pupil add-on for resource special education. So right off the bat, the state keeps 5%. The investors will receive payments in kindergarten through 6th grade. After 6th grade, the state of Utah retains 100% of the cost avoidance. And one of the reasons why this was attractive is that the state of Utah is not putting up any money for the intervention for preschool, yet they keep 5% of the state savings in K through 6 and then 100% thereafter. And for those of you with a finance background, that's an infinite internal rate of return for the government. There is a cap on the return to investor, which is equal to the AAA municipal money market data rate for a 10-year security plus 5%. And that's at the time that the contract is signed, and the cap is 7.26. The AAA municipal money market data rate for 10-year security at the time was 2.26. Next slide, please. I'm going to present a simplified economic model. It is one cohort using representative, not actual data. This example that you're going to see does not represent the economics of the transaction, but does go through the math. Also, this is a multi-cohort loan, and again, I've simplified it to use just one cohort. I've also simplified the capital stack. I do not present the senior sub loan structure. We look at the loan amount as one amount. And the variables in the economic model are the percent and number of children in the payment cohort. So that is the number and percent of children who score 2 or more standard deviations below the mean. Mobility, if a child leaves the state and we're not able to track them, the investors will not receive a payment for them. and the success rate, which is the percent of children in the payment cohort each year that do not receive an IEP. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to go through this almost line by line, and we'll start with B6, which is 500 children. Historically, 2/3 of the children have been 4-year-olds, and 1/3 have been 3-year-olds, and we keep that ratio. One thing that's really important, and I think that everybody certainly understands this from what happened with Rikers, is that it's very important to replicate what you're doing in the Pay for Success loan to reflect the analysis using historical data. So one thing we wanted to make very sure of is that the preschool program kept doing the same thing it's always been doing, that they recruited in the same way, that the referral pathways were the same way, and that the mix of 3- and 4-year-olds reflected the mix of 3- or 4-year-olds that we had historical data for. So that's very important. Again, the per child cost, these do not reflect actual numbers, but per child cost for a 3-year-old is assumed in this model as $2,000 per year, and for a 3-year-old is $3,500 per year. There was an expansion of classrooms. Again, this is not the actual number, but when you expand capacity, we did some new classrooms needed to be open, and there's an upfront classroom expense. If you look down then to B13, you'll see total program costs of $1.5 million. Over in column D, you'll see other costs. Again, I was not able to show these, but you'll have, in our model, we had upfront evaluator costs because children receive a pretest, and then there are ongoing evaluator costs because every year the only person that knows, or the only institution that knows who is in the payment cohort is the independent evaluator. And he matches numbers with records with administrative data to find out whether or not children in the payment cohort did or did not receive an IEP. It's a binary evaluation of yes or no. There's the fee for the intermediary and a fee for the performance manager. And depending upon the structure of your transaction, those fees might be different. You might have other costs. Ours is a fairly straightforward model. And so those were primarily the fees associated with it. You might see legal fees. You might see a validator. There are other costs that could be associated depending upon your transaction. So that gives you a total loan amount of E10 of $1.5 million. Excuse me. Moving down to E16. You'll see again, this is not the actual number, the weighted per pupil special education add-on for resource special education of 6,000. The percent scoring 70 or below on the PPVT, and that's the risk group, is 22%. That's right below that. The numbers in blue are our variables. And so those are the numbers that we don't know before the transaction is sealed. We have historical data, and we know what the average has been. We've done sensitivity analysis. But this essentially is part of the risk that the investors are taking, is what these numbers will be in actuality. So 22% are the percentage of children scoring 70 or below. That would give you, and we apply that to the 4-year-olds. The 4-year-olds, for each cohort, even though 2 years of preschool for 3-year-olds is being funded, it's in the following year when the 3-year-olds become 4-year-olds, and then when they move into kindergarten, that we follow them through grade school. But what matters is where they scored entering preschool. So if a child scores as a 3-year-old at a 65, for instance, and let's say after 1 year of preschool they're at a 75, they're still in the payment cohort because when they entered preschool, they were 2 or more standard deviations below the mean. And you can attribute their increase from 65 to 75 as resulting from preschool. Going down now to E18 is the percent that stay out of special education. And again, I put in an assumption there of 85%. And then below that is the percent of cost avoidance as a success payment, which is 95%. You'll see in column A, starting in line 22, is the year. In column B is preschool, kindergarten, and then the grades that they're in. And then we have mobility rate. Now, this is very important, actually. We looked at historical data going back many years for the state for this population of free and reduced lunch children and their rate of leaving the state. There's actually very high mobility district to district, but since we're able, this is a statewide initiative, and we're able to track kids even if they leave the district after preschool, we were able to use the state mobility rate, and it's on average 3%. And here, for instance, we modeled it each year because it can vary year to year. So if you look on F17, where you see the number of children in the payment cohort is 73, and that's 22% of the number of 4-year-olds, which is 330, you'll see that in column D24, or cell D24, that we assume here that 3 children, and there's rounding here, have moved from preschool out of the state into kindergarten. So right away, mobility can affect the return to the investor because the payment cohort was, number of children was 73, but only 70 remain in the state. So they essentially are not going to get paid for those 3 children, whether or not they're in special education. And total cost avoidance is 70, which is the number of children who remain in the state, times 85%, which is the percent of those children who scored 70 or below, who are in the payment cohort, who did not in kindergarten need an IEP, and then times 6,000, which is the, and this is the marginal cost. This, Danielle was talking about fixed and marginal costs. We only looked at marginal costs. We did not assume, one, because we weren't going to get to a large enough scale in one transaction, that we, and also the attrition rate for special education teachers is quite high, so we did not assume there being any reduction in personnel. All we were looking at is if a child, special education in Utah is funded on a headcount basis, and if a child who was statistically projected to have a high likelihood of needing special education without high-quality regular education preschool ended up not needing an IEP because they had high-quality regular education preschool, then that child does not show up in the headcount, and that's an avoided cost. That money stays in the regular education budget of the state, and so that is what we use as the total cost avoidance. So in column E and in cell E24, you'll see that when you do the math, that turns out to be a total cost avoidance for kindergarten of $359,152. And if you go over to F25, you'll see that $341,194 is 95% of $359,152. Now, the reason it's a year later is because, well, those are their savings in kindergarten. The investor is not paid until the following year, actually, when the child is entering first grade. And so there's a year lag. And for the return to investor, it's very important the timing of the cash flows. And I don't think I need to go down necessarily every column, but I'll just do one more where E25 is the cost avoidance is 68 children. So again, we assume that 3% leave the state, times 85%, which is the percentage of children who did not need an IEP. That's a success rate. Times 6,000 will be 348, 377, and if you look at F26, 95% of that is $330,958. And you'll see that it stops after 6th grade. And I think I might have left out kindergarten, first, second, third, fourth, fifth. Okay, so my apologies. I actually, it should go down one more cell to F31, but I think you probably understand the methodology. You'll see that since all payments stop after 6th grade, there's still cost avoidance. The state of Utah is still saving money, even if there is mobility out of the state, but all the payments to the investors stop after 6th grade. That is the simplified one cohort financial models. I do want to emphasize that all these numbers are hypothetical and do not reflect the actual economics of the transaction. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide. Great, thank you. Just to sum up, the way I look at it is the economic model is the foundation for the financial model. And what you're really trying to do in the economic model, once you've identified the impact of the intervention and once you've looked at the timing of outcome, what the outcome metrics might be, you're really looking to assess what is the internal rate of return of the intervention, which is simply what is the cost of the intervention and what are either the fiscal savings or the outcome payments that a government might want to make, and what is the timing of those savings and payments. And that will give you what the internal rate of return of the intervention is. And the timing of the outcomes that trigger success payments is extremely important, as well as the amount of the payment, and that will impact the viability of the financial model. And what you really want to do, and I think it's important to keep this in mind as you pick outcome metrics, one, you want to pick outcome metrics, of course, that are important to both the intervention and to the government, and as Danielle was talking about, when you align incentives and goals. But you also want to think about the timing of that. So for instance, because special education assignment happens every year, kindergarten through 12th grade, we're able to make a success payment very early on. And for those of you, again, with a financial background will know that the internal rate of return of a cash flow is greatest the sooner success payments can be made, the better it is for the financial model. And that's a time value of money concept. And some helpful concepts I think will help you think about how to build your economic model, what outcome metrics to pick. And the very important aspect of timing is internal rate of return and net present value. Actually, bond math is probably the most helpful financial concept in building an economic model. And with that, I think I will open it up to questions.
Everyone is now unmuted.
Wow.
Jenny, are you there?
I am. I was just about to say that if folks don't have questions at the moment, you know, obviously we're in very close touch with Janice and Danielle, so we could certainly facilitate your question being answered after the webinar. Any questions about how Janice and Danielle approached the financial model? Are you all thinking about it somewhat differently? Good things for us to be thinking about as we all continue our work. I think, you know, for me, the thing that I'm really reflecting on is just how many sub-grantees and sub-recipients were joining us on the webinar. And so I would hope and imagine that the information transmitted from Janice and Danielle today will help you begin to think through as you begin to narrow your target population, narrow the type of service that you know that you'll expect to provide, just exactly what your model might look like. And I hope that you can use this in the coming months. So any other final questions? Last call.
Hey, Jenny. With GHHI. I'll ask another question. Yeah, so thanks, Janice. I guess the question to both Janice and Danielle. So in terms of creating a financial model, are there going to be like multiple financial models? So like the intermediary, I guess, would have one, and then I'm guessing investors might have their own version. Is that the case, or was that the case for your projects? And if so, you know, how did that work?
Sure. Well, every not every partner in the deal, but it's very possible that several partners in the deal will have a model. Yeah, the state has a model, the United Way of Salt Lake has a model, and the investors have a model, but we sync up. So it's very important that we all agree on what the payment metrics will be, how much the payment will be, what the timing is. And the only way to do that is if your models are aligned. And we had a very close partnership here. And, you know, it was a very collaborative process. And so, yes, everyone does. I mean, for instance, you know, I've not modeled out here the senior-sub relationship here, but the model that the investors have, of course, does separate out the senior and the sub loan. And so, yes, but it's extremely important that you align and that you match numbers. Yeah, you do. Yeah, and the other thing is to have someone check your numbers. You can't, everyone at some point makes a mistake. I mean, it's just inevitable. And so you want a few people kicking the tires and asking tough questions and double checking your math and, you know, making sure, you know, certainly that all the math is right, all the assumptions are right. And don't be surprised if there are mistakes. I used to work on Wall Street, and I don't think I've ever worked on anything where we didn't find at least one mistake. But it's but the important thing is to catch it.
Yeah, I agree. It was the same with us. There's one master financial model, and as you can guess, it's big. It's a really crazy spreadsheet with multiple tabs and multiple levers that also allows you to see what happens as the level of success changes and how that impacts payments. And it really was an all-hands-on-deck type of endeavor, where I encourage you to draw on all the expertise that's available to you, whether you have technical assistance from someplace like the SIB Lab or whatever intermediary you're working for. These are certainly new undertakings, and every project's different, even for entities that have done several pay for success projects. So just because you've never done it before doesn't mean you can't. And have everybody look at it, have everybody come together, and have that one then shared understanding of costs and payments that you can continue to go back through as the project evolves.
That's a really great question, Kevin. Thank you. Anyone else? Well, thank you all so much. We have recorded the webinar, so we'll go ahead and send you the recording as soon as we get it back. And just thank you all so much again for dialing in with us. We'll have a short survey for you sent out either later today or tomorrow. So thank you all again so much. You have our information. If you need to reach me, I can pass your name on to Janice and Danielle. They can help you answer any additional questions that you might have. So thank you, everyone, and hope you have a wonderful Monday. Take care.
Thanks. Thanks, guys.